The CSS language is in charge of giving the content of a web page its appearance. And this appearance can be broken down into 3 categories. And in order to see them a little bit better, let me just remove the appearance from this example page. And all we are now left with is the plain HTML content of this page, and what is gone and therefore belongs to the appearance are first of all the stylistic aspects, including colors, shadows, borders, etc. Secondly, what is gone and therefore belongs to the appearance are the dimensions and the positioning of the content. And finally, number 3, what also belongs to the appearance are some functional aspects that we can give to the content. For example, we can make content to become resizable, we can make it move in motion over time, and therefore in this regards there is a little bit an overlap to the JavaScript language, because JavaScript is also used on the web to give the content of a web page its functionality. Before we can give our content its appearance, we first of all, of course, need to determine which part of our content shall now receive the appearance. And therefore, besides the appearance, the actual selection part is also another big task that the CSS language is in charge of. So our content is being made up of these individual elements, and therefore we are selecting the elements, and once we have selected them, then upon that we give them their stylistic aspects, we give them their functionality, and also their dimensions and positioning. Any coding language out there that is being developed also requires the development of an according piece of software that is then able to understand that coding language. It is like chicken and egg. The one only exists for the other, and in CSS the piece of software that does understand the CSS code is referred to as the CSS parser, which means CSS reader. It reads, it parses our CSS code, and then it can act accordingly. Such a CSS parser is always built into a larger software. And all these software together that have a CSS parser and also an HTML parser included, they are referred to as user agents, because they are the middleman, the agent to the end user. They sit in the middle between the code and the end user and bring that code across to the end user in one form or another, by visually displaying it or by communicating it in form of a voice. And one such user agent, for example, is the browser. And the browser, once it has passed the CSS code, it will then be used for a visual display inside the browser window. Another example of a visual user agent are email applications, such as, for example, Microsoft Outlook, etc. And they do also contain a CSS parser, and therefore when we have a purchase or a registration on our website and we want to send out a purchase or a registration confirmation via email, then we can also apply CSS there, due to the fact that such user agents do also understand the CSS code, because they have a CSS parser being built into them. And then it will be used once again for a visual display inside the email application software window that is being used. And now a final example where the user agent is not visually displaying things, and that are screen reader software. They do communicate the content of a web page in form of a voice. Therefore, they do not visually display anything. However, they still contain a CSS parser, because in CSS, among the stylistic things that we can apply to our content, we can also determine how the voice shall be styled, whether it shall be a female or a male voice, when the voice shall pause, when it shall emphasize something, what volume to use, and so on. And therefore it is also such non-visual user agents that do contain a CSS parser. Now all these user agents, what their CSS parser needs to understand is the syntax of the language. And the syntax is always referring to the symbols and how the language is being used in general. The symbols always are the indicator to the CSS parser when something starts and when something ends. So the parser then always clearly knows what is what inside the code. In terms of vocabulary, however, what the parser needs to understand, that again depends on the purpose of the user agent, what it fulfills. For example, screen readers, they communicate things in form of a voice, and therefore they need to understand the vocabulary that relates to the voice. Vocabulary that relates to visual appearance, such as, for example, a height or a background, that is irrelevant for such parsers, for such user agents where the parser is being built in. Now, the other way around, of course, for visual user agents, they need to understand the vocabulary that is for visual display, and what the voice vocabulary determines, that is irrelevant for them. And now in regards to the email applications, they are being used to display email content and not actual website content. So rather textual document content that they do display. And that is also the reason why they do not fully understand the full visual vocabulary of the CSS language. So they basically only understand basic CSS that already existed since CSS level number 1, CSS version number 1. And it is only the browser that fully understands the full, or to the greatest extent understands the full vocabulary that is for visual display. So it is the email applications understand, for example, when we are styling text, we can do so, we can style tables and lists, etc. Rather a textual focus on that one. But anything else, basically, that is only the user agent browser who is able to understand such vocabulary for visual display. Now the vocabulary and also the syntax in general is being determined at the W3C, which is the organization behind the World Wide Web. In short, it means World Wide Web Consortium, and it comprises a lot of members. Basically, any tech company, or all the big tech companies at least, have their representatives at the W3C, and it involves also other organizations, for example, that represent the sight disabled community, for example. And there at this organization, they together decide which direction the CSS language shall go. For example, what new vocabulary shall be released in the future. And when the majority decides up on one direction, then anybody, all the user agents are supposed to implement that vocabulary inside their parser. So when it's for visual display, then the visual user agents are supposed to implement it. And if it is for verbal communication, then all the screen readers, etc., need to implement that vocabulary. And then it's considered to be, once everybody has agreed, it's considered to be a recommendation. It's considered to be a standard then. Since the CSS version number 2, the language was divided up into individual parts, so-called modules. And each module, in order for the language to become better manageable. And one module is in charge of text, for example, the text appearance, one for background appearance, for shapes, and so on. And some modules are in level number 1, some in level number 3, some even in level number 4. And therefore, since version number 2 of the CSS language, since level number 2, there is no level number 3 actually. Even though this name is most often used to just refer to the latest version of CSS, but due to the language being broken down into individual modules and those modules being in a different level, therefore a common level number 3 does not actually exist. Before we now go into the actual syntax of the CSS language, let us first of all discuss 3 locations where the CSS code can be written at. And that is, first of all, inside an external CSS file, meaning a file with the format .css. And here, when we can write our CSS, but of course, the CSS is always for our HTML code, for our HTML document, for our content inside our HTML document. And therefore, it must refer to that code somehow. And therefore, we must associate the external CSS code with that code inside here by including the CSS file inside the HTML document. And that is done inside the head element because it is something for the content, and it's done by using the link element. And what we need to specify, of course, is the path to where the CSS file is being located. And what we also need to specify is the relationship. In what relationship is that including file to the content? And due to the fact that we are now including a CSS file, therefore it's being referred to, the value that must be used here is style sheet. And that is exactly what a CSS file is usually called. It is our style sheet in which our CSS code is inside. And style sheet is also the SS within the abbreviation Cascading Style Sheet, CSS. So that is one option that we do have, and now let's go into an example. Since now our code is associated with our content here, we can now select from our content, which I have already done, the header element, and I have given it now a little bit of a dimension, a height, and a stylistic aspect of a background color in blue. Let us take a look at this one in a visual user agent, the browser, and this is how things are now being displayed. Now comes the option number 2. We can write the CSS code inside our HTML document itself by using the style element. And now when the HTML parser passes our HTML code, it encounters the style element and then it knows, inside here is now CSS code. And I myself, as HTML parser, I'm not able to understand this code, and therefore I pass it on to the CSS parser, who will then do that job. And we do assign, or we do apply the CSS code here in exactly the same way as externally. We select from our content, from our elements, and then we give them a certain appearance, such as, for example, a certain dimension in this case, and once again a certain stylistic aspect of a background color in light gray. And this is what now got applied here by viewing things inside the visual user agent, the browser. Now the last option is we can also write the CSS code inside the element itself. And because this is done inside, in the same line with the element, therefore it is being referred to as inline styling. And it is done by using the style attribute. And this attribute, or inside here, come the appearance that we want to give to the element. And here it is already known which element the appearance will refer to, and therefore the selection part is not needed anymore. We go directly into the actual appearance, but again in exactly the same manner as we have done it before up here. So again, I've just given it a certain dimension, and in this case a stylistic aspect with a background color in green, and this is what now got applied here. So these are the 3 options that we do have. However, this is sometimes used when we are working with the dynamic languages, such as, for example, JavaScript, or when we are creating our content dynamically by drawing it from databases using, for example, PHP, etc. Then this option is sometimes used when we are developing our website and we do not want to switch between files, but otherwise these options in general should be prevented from being used. Instead, the CSS code should in general at least be located inside an external CSS file, inside its own style sheet. And there are 3 reasons for this. And reason number 1 is that the CSS code that is located inside a CSS file can be reused. So reusability. And that reason is mainly referring to websites that are not created dynamically, because then we always have an HTML document for each page of our website. So that is now our home page, then we have our HTML document for a subpage, and then another HTML document for our next subpage, and so on. And however, some of these pages, they all together share certain content and therefore the same appearance. Let us take a look at this on this example page here, because what is being shared, for example, is the header, which is usually the same on each and every page that we have. What is usually also the same is the box in which the main content is inside. Now the content itself, of course, that one varies then depending on the page that we have, but the box usually is the same. Now what is also usually the same is the footer of the web page. And due to the fact that this content is always the same, therefore, of course, also the CSS code that is used to give the appearance to that content is also the same. The point here is now, when we have our CSS code inside the HTML document, then this CSS code can only refer to that, exactly to that content inside here, to those elements. And if we want that main element to look the same on our subpage, what we could do, of course, we could copy and paste it over to here, but then we duplicate our code. That would first of all increase our file sizes, and secondly, and more importantly even, if we do have any changes to the main element, how it shall look, or to the footer or to the header, then we need to go into multiple files and to do these changes, which of course is very inefficient. Instead, now comes the reason why the CSS code should be located in an external file and not inside the HTML document, because when our CSS code is located here entirely, then all we need to do is we take that link element and just include that CSS file inside here as well, and therefore each and every page will then share the same look, or the same CSS code, and the appearance will be applied to each and every page that we have. Now what just happened, we have seen when I just clicked the link, the appearance did not get applied first of all. And that is now, comes now under reason number 2, why the CSS code should be located inside an external CSS file. And that is the reason of cacheability. Cacheability means storability. The user agent is able to store CSS code inside his software, but only when it is located inside an external CSS file. HTML content, including any CSS code that is located inside here, cannot be stored, cannot be cached by the user agent. And now the benefit of caching. Let's assume, for example, that we visit this website here for the first time today. What happens? Wheel starts to turn, and that is exactly the time when the code is coming back from the server of this web page, including HTML code and CSS code. Now when we do go to a subpage, what happens? Once again, the code is being retrieved now from the server. The point here is that the HTML code was now being retrieved because it cannot be cached, but the CSS code was not being retrieved once again because it is cacheable. And therefore it was already passed by the user agent, in this case by the browser, and it could then immediately apply the CSS code to the content, which improves how fast our website will be displayed, and it also does not cause another server request to occur, and therefore it also saves bandwidth. So that is reason number 2, and now comes the reason why actually just once we click the link the first time here, why the CSS code did not get applied, and that is exactly for cacheability. Because once things get cached, then any changes that we do inside our CSS style sheet, they will not get applied, because the browser is using a cached version of our CSS file where those changes have not yet taken effect. And that is of course bad when we are in the development of a website, because we wanted to see our changes immediately happening. And now there are two options, or there are more options, but two options that we will now go over how to prevent that cache. And one option is by using a developer toolbar, and here we can then disable the cache, at least for the websites during our development phase. And a second option that we do have is that works in most of the browsers at least, is by hitting Ctrl F5. And that will reload the page without considering the cache. So that is reason number 2 in general, and now comes reason number 3 why the CSS code should be located inside an external file, and that is the simple reason of having the languages CSS and HTML divided up. When we create websites, they become large. It's a lot of code ultimately in CSS and also in HTML, and we are always thankful the more overseeable our code is. And by having the languages divided up, clearly it becomes better overseeable. So that is reason number 3. And now we are going into the syntax of the CSS language. And hereby I am taking this code now and actually use the inside the HTML document method here by using the style element, so that we do not need to switch between files. And here what we are always doing is we are selecting from the content. And that is always divided up by this opening of a curly bracket. And as mentioned already, the symbols, the syntax, they are the indicators to the parser when something starts and when something ends. And if those symbols were not there, because the parser has no eyes, things are being removed, then there would be no indicator and the parser would not know what to do. And therefore that clearly indicates him, and the people just decided upon these curly brackets to use. So this is the end of the selection. That is the beginning then of the actual appearance, and this is then the end of the appearance. And then it knows it goes on, and then it goes again. The selection, the end, now comes appearance, and so on. Then what we want and how we want it must be divided up as well. The symbol used here is just the colon, and the end of what we want in terms of appearance and how we want it is divided up by a semicolon. And then it's clearly known to the parser, now it's over, now comes the next one. What we want, how we want it, and so on. This one is being referred to as the selector. This is the how we want, and this is what we want and how we want it in terms of appearance. This one is the property, and this one is the value. Together, the property and the value together are referred to as either a CSS rule or a CSS declaration. And the entire block here is referred to as CSS declaration block. And that is the basic syntax of the CSS language. And now we are going into further, more detailed syntax, first in regards to the selectors. There are 4 different types of selectors, each of them using their own syntax. So 4 categories, and the first category that we are now discussing of selectors, they do select the elements by their attributes. So we can select, so we can select really any element by any of their attributes that they do have, and also by any of their values and how those values start or how these values end, for example, and that these fall under the category of the so-called attribute selectors. And they are always done by using these brackets as syntax. And then it's very simple, and then once again it comes then the regular syntax here, and here comes the CSS rules, the actual appearance. And inside here we just determine, all we need to do is determine, for example, an attribute such as the href attribute, and whatever we now define inside here will apply to all elements that have that href attribute. And in the same syntax as we use it inside our HTML code, we can now also use it here to define not only an attribute but also an according value. So inside here, whatever appearance we define, it will then apply to all elements that have the class attribute with the value of whatever, some value, for example. And that is now how we can make that happen for each and every attribute. And in order to be more specific based on a certain attribute, we can also use certain symbols right in here, right after the attribute name. For example, this symbol. And then we are selecting all the elements who have the class attribute whose value starts with a certain value. So whatever that then is ultimately. Or anything that ends with a certain value. Or among one of the values is a certain value. So that is the syntax here. The brackets are being used for these attribute selectors. And if we want to be more specific in regards to how we want to select the elements based on their attribute values, then certain symbols can be used here in addition as well. And that's category number 1, the specific syntax that is used for these so-called attribute selectors. And hereby we always selected the elements indirectly based on their attributes. And now anything else, also any other selector that selects the elements now goes under the category of so-called element selectors. And that actually also includes 2 selectors that once again also select the element based on 2 attributes. And these are the ones that select based on the class and the ID attribute. These 2 have received their own syntax because their only purpose of the attributes here is so that the element becomes selectable, either uniquely by its ID value or commonly by its class value. and those selectors, they existed from the very beginning, before even attribute selectors existed, and therefore they have their own they have their own syntax by which elements can be selected. So when we are selecting by class, then we are using the period. When we are selecting by identity, we are using the ## symbol. So in this case, we are selecting the element that has the ID value with X, Y. So this is referring to this element, and then we can give it this specifically, only this element, a certain appearance, or we can give all the elements that have this class, for example, we can give a common appearance too. So these ones go already under the category of element selections, just because they have received their own syntax. Now what also goes under that category is, for example, the star symbol, the asterisk, and hereby we are selecting all the elements right now. Then the selectors that we have made use of up here already, they are selecting the elements by its type, so header, main, footer, etc. And therefore they also go under the category of element selectors. And now in addition, what also goes under that category is the possibilities to combine selections. So for example, we can use a comma here and then select the next one. We can use a comma and select the next one based on an attribute selectors. Now it will select all the footer elements that are of type footer. Additionally, it will also select all the elements who have a class attribute value with S. So that is how we can combine things, and what we can do here, of course, with other symbols, for example, all the children of the footer with the class whose value is S, and for example, all the sibling elements. So that is the syntax that is being used here. We can combine things, and there is certain symbols that we can use additionally here, which all fall under the category of element selectors. And that's category number 2. And now come 2 further categories, and they do not select the element directly. Instead, they are either used with attribute selectors or any of the element selectors, because they do select the elements. And then based on that element selection, we can go further down, specify, refine the selection. And for example, we can then select the header element, but only when it is under a certain condition, state under which it is in. For example, when it is being hovered over by, for example, the mouse, or when it is during the time when it's being clicked, for example, by the mouse, so-called activated. So that is, for example, what we can do. But these state selectors, they do not select the element directly. They are just being used with either element or attribute selectors who do select the elements. And these are attached by a semicolon, by a colon always, and then whatever we want, what state we are referring to. And therefore, because they do not select the element directly, therefore they are referred to as faked or perfectly pseudo selectors. And since there are 2 different types of pseudo selectors, one coming in a moment, to differentiate between them, these ones that select a certain state that the element must be under, these ones are referred to as pseudo class selectors. So let's do an example here, and let's give it a background color in gray. And now once we hover over the element, it will then turn into that background color, but only once it is under that state, by using those pseudo class selectors that are being attached by a single colon. And now come the next pseudo selectors, the 4th category of selectors that use their own syntax. And once again, they are pseudo selectors. They are not selecting the element directly, so they are used once again in combination with actual element or attribute selectors who do select the element. For example, let's select the P element, and now come 2 colons, which, to differentiate them from the state selectors, now come the selectors that select a sub-part of the element. For example, a sub-part could be the first letter inside the element, or the first line of text, or the placeholder text that is within an input element, for example. And those subparts, these are pseudo element selectors, not pseudo class, pseudo elements. They are done with 2 colons. For example, let's give the first letter of the P element, let's give it now a font weight in bold. And just to have an example here as well, now the letter S is being bolded right in here. So these is the syntax of the 4 different categories of selectors that do exist, and this is how things are divided up. So selectors, element, attribute, pseudo-class, pseudo-element selectors, and once we have selected our content, then upon that we give it its dimensions and positioning, their styling, and also their functionality. Let's go into further syntax in regards to the values. Most of the time the values are just used as we have done it right here. Sometimes, however, we are calling a function, and that is sometimes quite often the case. And whenever we are calling a function, whatever it is right now, then we are calling it by its name, whatever its name is, and then we are attaching those brackets afterwards. And inside these brackets comes certain information that the function needs. So what is a function? Any software out there is just created by code as well, including the CSS parser. It's just code, nothing else. And then there is a block of code inside the CSS parser that is in charge of that functionality, another block of code that is in charge of that functionality, and so on. And these block of codes can have names, and we can call them if we want them to do us a certain functionality. For example, inside the background, we can call a function that is, its name is linear gradient, and we can ask it, hey, create us an image, please. Do the functionality of creating us an image with merging colors, color gradient and a gradient image. And what we need to supply, of course, are the colors that we want the image to be based on, the gradients. So let's give him some colors, yellow, red, and green, for example. And now let's take a look at this one, how this one appears. And here we can see the result right now. So that is, we can call a function by its name, and it will then do us a certain functionality. In this case, it will just do us it will create us an image based on the colors that we give him. It will create us a gradient image. So now that is in terms of function, the syntax. So it's always the brackets that are used hereby, and we are calling it by its name. And now comes the syntax in regards to when we do specify a value that is based on text and varies depending how we do want the text to be. Then this is always written then within either double or single quotation marks. So that can be the case either inside functions or not inside functions. Let's go with functions first. So here for this property we can determine whether we want to use an image inside the background of the element. And let me actually now copy and paste this over to the actual header here. So whether we want to use an image. Now we are calling a function because this one is able, the function whose name is Earl, that can initiate the fetching of the image from the server. Now inside here comes the path that of course is required for the function to do its job, for the image to be able to be fetched. And this path varies depending where our image is being located. So we specify it in terms of text, wherever it is, our image, and then it can be fetched. But the point here is, whenever text varies, it must be written within either single or double quotation marks. Now the same applies, for example, to the content property. This one can be used in certain situations to insert content within the element. And what textual content we want to insert varies depending what we want, and therefore it must be written within either single or double quotation marks. So that is another syntax a syntax point in regards to the values for the properties. And now we are going into the properties themselves. Usually they are used according to the vocabulary that defines them, as they are right here. However, properties can also be in testing phase. And whenever they are in testing phase, they must be prefixed. For example, if we have the property ABCD and this one is in testing phase, it must be prefixed with 2 dashes always, and then there is a certain name that goes inside these 2 dashes. And now comes the reason for these two, or for a testing phase in general. I mentioned in the beginning that the browsers are the only visual user agents that must understand the full, or should understand the full vocabulary for visual display. And because they are the major user agents that will display websites in comparison to email applications, which do not need to understand the full vocabulary. And that is the most difficult task is the visual display according to what the CSS code defines. And since the browser needs to understand the full CSS code in regards the full vocabulary in regards to visual display, it's a very comprehensive job that they need to do. How will things be laid out inside this window according to what code defines what we determine finally as web developers what the code should be. And this laying out is such a difficult job, and it is the core part of the browser what it is doing. And that core part inside the browser, that piece inside there, which is also just code, of course, that is referred to as the browser engine. And each browser, or some browsers, use different browser engines, meaning based on different code. And therefore they need to, it's quite an extensive task that this browser engine needs to do. And therefore when a new property is being released, it sometimes is in testing phase. And they will test it at the browsers, of course, and also at the W3C. But sometimes the testing is not sufficient there. It needs to be tested more extensively. So they then decide to release the property in its prefixed version so that web developers can then make use of that property in its prefixed version. So because they will use that property in so many combinations with other properties, and they test it thereby indirectly. And whenever there is a problem, they can report it then to the browsers. And should there be a problem, then the behavior of the property, the door must still be open for them to change the property, either its behavior or its name even. But the prefixed version must remain unchanged, because web developers have already made use of this prefixed version on websites that they have created in the past. And if the behavior of that prefixed version would change, that of course means that the websites that were created in the past, their behavior would change as well, which is of course never a good thing. It is then not so-called backward compatible. And that's the reason for those prefixes, because then those changes in behavior will only be done on the property itself. So it keeps the window open for having the ability to still do changes on the property. Now that is the testing phase, so now comes the actual prefix that must be in here, what name we need to use. So the testing is always based on the browser engine, and different browsers do use different browser engines, and therefore we need to, when a property is in testing phase in all the browser engines, we need to specify it for each and every browser engine once. Because a testing phase can last not as long in one browser engine than it does in another one. So it must be based on all the different browser engines. For example, one of which is Mozilla Firefox. It uses the Gecko browser engine. Then the next one is MS, which is Microsoft. It uses the Trident browser engine. Next one is for Opera browsers, which uses the Presto browser engine. And last one is WebKit. That's the browser engine name itself. And this one is used by the Safari browsers and by the Google browsers, including Chrome, Android, etc. So we need to specify it for each and every one separately, and they will then always know, that's me, I will skip this one, I will skip this one, and this one if I'm a Mozilla Firefox browser, and I will only choose this one single rule here. And now let's assume that the Opera browser now comes along tomorrow and says, hey, we are done with testing. So then the property can be used here just regularly as we are usually doing it. And it will then, the Opera, the Presto browser engines will then use this property, and they will skip all these ones. So the testing phase can be longer in one browser than it is the case in other browsers. So let's take a look at an actual property that is currently, as of mid-November 2017, still in testing phase, and that is user select. And this is always, whenever there is a cross-browser issue, then it's always indicated here, and a link will then lead us to a web page called Can I Use, where we can find further information what the issue with that property is. And here we can see everything is actually green, so everything is fine. However, there is a little dash at the top right corner of the boxes. And that is what indicates, hey, this property can already be used inside, and for the web developers, they can make use of it. It's fine in all the browsers. However, it must be prefixed. And here we can see, for example, the Opera browser as well as the Chrome browser, they already removed the testing phase. It's already over inside their browsers, but for all the other ones, it is still being required. Now this testing phase, this can also be the case for actual selectors as well. And these prefixes are not only used for testing phases, but also for in-house selectors or in-house properties that the different browsers may have. Because sometimes they, even though a certain property or a certain selector is not yet a standard, so the members at the W3C have not yet agreed upon a certain property or a selector. Some browsers still say, hey, I want to implement this already, but in order to prevent any collision of names in the future, when it will maybe become a standard, therefore such in-house selectors or properties, they are also prefixed with the according prefix that the browser is using. Now, two more comments in regards to the syntax before we go into the greater logic, and that is, inside our external style sheets we can always include some other things. But in general, whatever we include, the syntax that is being used here for is the @ symbol. So that's the indicator to the parser, hey, now we are including something. And now comes a certain keyword, and that keyword will then define what we are including. For example, we can include a font family that we have downloaded, for example, that we want to use for our text on the web page, or we can include another CSS file, for example, which is possible here. And here goes the path then. So that, but in general, in terms of the syntax, it's the @ symbol that is used for inclusion. Now, irrespective of whether our CSS code is written in an external style sheet or whether it is located inside our HTML document, we can always create comments. And comments are commonly used in CSS. And they are done to open the comment. The syntax that's being used here is a / followed by one or more asterisk selectors, and then the closing of it is once again done by using the asterisks and the /. And whatever we want to comment then, so it's just for us to keep our code a little bit more organized, what is what inside our code, and what we can also use it for. We can uncomment certain code in case we do not want to delete it. We may want to reuse it later on, but now it's uncommented and therefore it will not be used for the appearance of our content. So in this case, it's outcommented the header, and now the header will not receive any appearance anymore. So that is what the comments are used for and the syntax here for. And now we are going into the greater logic of the CSS language. And that is in particular referring to the C in CSS, which stands for cascading. And the cascading is referring to the process of finding out which declared values to use for a property on each and every element out there. So which of the declared values to use for the properties on an element. And right now we may say, isn't it clear, whatever we define as values under a certain element, that is what shall be used ultimately. But sometimes it is the case that we do specify the same property multiple times for the same element with a different value. For example, let's assume inside our main element were 4 p elements, or let's say 5 p elements, and 4 of these p elements shall share a same appearance, and only the last p element, his appearance shall be differently. So instead of selecting each p element inside here separately of the 5 that would be inside here, the better alternative would be selecting the parent, the main element, and then traverse down. So we are now selecting the p, all the children of the main elements that are p elements, and then we give them a certain property with whatever value we want to use. And now the last p element, for example, if that was the last one of the 5, we can then select separately and just give it then its own appearance for that certain property, its own value, whatever that one is. Now the question, however, becomes, because inside that selection are all 5 p elements, meaning all 5, including the last one, will receive that value. And now we have selected it once again individually, and here we have specified a different value. So the question is, which value will now be chosen? Which of the declared values will now be chosen? And that depends on how specific the selector here is. It comes down to so-called the topic of specificity, which refers to the specificity of the selector. The one that is more specific, that is where the value will then be chosen from. And that is now what we are going over in terms of our span element as an example. So here is a span element. It has an identity attribute and also a class attribute with a certain value each of them. And I have now selected this span element 4 times. Once by its identity, once by its class, and 2 times by its element type, by its tag name. And each time I've used the same property, but each time with a different value. And now which text color will now the span element have? Let's take a look, and it is the color blue. The reason for this is because the ID selection is most specific among all these selectors, and therefore the value that was defined here for the color property will now be chosen. And the reason why it is more specific is very simple, because an identity is always unique. The value we cannot hand out to multiple elements, and therefore the maximum amount of elements that will be inside this selection is a single one, and therefore this selection is most specific. Now comes the class selector. Let us uncomment the identity, and the text color is now being displayed in brown, because a class selector is more specific than when we are selecting by element type, because there can be many span elements on our web page, but only some of them may have a class value. Therefore, inside such a selection can be less elements than it is the case when we are selecting all of them by type. And that's the reason why the color brown was being chosen. Let us uncomment this one here. And now what we do have are 2 selections of the element that are same specific, because both of the time they are selecting the span element by its type. Now the question is, will it now be purple or will it be yellow? And it will be yellow. The simple reason for this is because whenever the same specificity occurs inside the selection, then the latter one will be chosen, because for the simple reason the CSS parser passes our code starting from top left, going to bottom right, and therefore whatever comes last will override the previous one. Let me now uncomment these ones once again, and let us now use another possibility that we have seen to give the appearance by using inline styling. And let us now define a color right in here. And inline styling can only refer to one single element. So from a logical point, it is same specific as an identity. However, the color will still be aqua and it will not be blue. The reason for this is just in general here. Style always overrides. However specific these selections are, this one always rules, unless, and now comes the last piece of this specificity, unless a certain value has the important rule being attached. And that is done by using an exclamation mark followed by the keyword important. And now the color will in fact be purple, because that will always win whenever we specify important. So here it is specificity. Whenever inline styling will override the whatever we specify in here, unless the important rule was being attached. Now this important rule is, we can use it of course whenever we encounter a specificity issue, just to quickly override it, to remedy this, to solve the problem of specificity and just attach this one. It should be prevented in general though. The reason why the important rule actually exists comes in a moment, but let's first of all go into a pointing system that we can use if we want to, if it helps us. Because most often, this example that we have just used, most often the selection is more detailed, more complicated than this one. So we can therefore assign certain points to certain selection parts, and the one that ends up with most points will therefore be most specific. So any element type that's being selected, for example span, receives 1 point. Any element selection by class, attribute or pseudo selectors, 10 points. Any identity selection, 100 points. Any inline styling, 1000, and important, 10,000. So basically these selections will never exceed 1000. So this is just to indicate that inline styling will always win unless important is being attached. And that's the final, that one will always win. So let's go into an example here. How specific in terms of points is this example selector here? What we are selecting all the div elements of type div that are children of the elements that have the class child container. So here we are dealing with a class, which is 10 points, and with a type selector, which is 1 point. So that is 11. Another one, that is, we are selecting the first line within the div, within the elements that are of type div, that are children of the element with the identity main container. So identity, 100 points. This is a type, which is 1 point, 101. And a pseudo selector, which is 10, which is 111 in total. Now another one, a little bit more complicated one, which doesn't make any sense, but just to get familiar with the pointing system. So all the descendants, that's the white space, all the descendants that have the class DEF, that are descendants of the div element with the class ABC in the time when they are under the condition of being activated, when the mouse is being pressed on it, for example. So that is a class, that is 10 points, that's a pseudo, 10 points again, attribute, 10 points, and a type selector, which is 1 point, total 31. So that is specificity. And hereby, the browser figures out, therefore by specificity, which of the declared values it will use, and that is part of this cascading. However, it is not yet done. Because we as web developers, we are not the only ones that do declare values. So there are two more parties that do make use of or can make use of style sheets in order to declare certain values for certain elements. And that, for example, first of all, is the user agent. And we are now taking a look at the browser hereby. The user agents or the visual user agents in general, according to whatever meaning an element has, they already define a certain default look to the element by just defining certain default values for certain properties on the element. For example, when we are taking a look at the H1 element, it is used for headlines. And headlines are usually, it has the meaning, or it is usually they are displayed in a greater font size a little bit larger, and they are displayed in their own line. Nothing can be next to it. Anything else will be in somewhere further down below with a little bit a gap towards the bottom and the top. So that is how headlines are usually displayed, and therefore that is what the user agent, in this case let's take a look at the browser, what it does by default. So this is the Mozilla Firefox browser style sheet. And all it does here is, once again, it selects in the same way as we do. It's just CSS. It selects the H1 element from the very beginning, and then it gives it already from the very beginning, it gives it a default appearance, and that is exactly the appearance that we can see here, which was achieved by the values that are defined right here. And that is what the browser does, according to the meaning of the element, how it would most likely, according to the meaning, how it would most likely appear. And that helps us as web developers, because that means we do not need to write as much code anymore, because often what the browser defines in his so-called default style sheet with his default values, that is already how we want it as well for that element. And therefore there is an advantage. It helps us to write less code. And we as web developers, we are considered to be the author. So we can always override that. So let's just select the H1 element here, and let's give it, for example, a font size of 12 pixels only, which is a very tiny font size. And let's just take a look inside here, and we can see whatever the browser has defined for the font size inside here, our declared value will rule. We override whatever the user agent defines. And now comes another party that makes use of a style sheet or can make use of a style sheet, and that is the end user. And the end user can make some default settings already, how each website shall look like, for example, what colors to use, whatever the end user wants to specify, whatever he prefers in general in terms of colors, the end user can do so. And the end user always overrides the user agent defaults as well. And then come we as web developer, we are referred to as the author, and we do always override whatever the user specifies in the browser settings, and we also override what the user agent specifies as default values. And the user agent, however, and now this is where the important rule comes in, the actual purpose of it, the user agent should, however, in situations have always the final say. So it's not only, the user cannot only specify some preference things because the user visually prefers some things to be in a certain way. Sometimes it is in fact needed by the user. For example, a colorblind person can only read text written on a certain color, for example. So that user must be able to change the settings, to override whatever we as author, as web developer specify. It must have the final say, and therefore the user can have the final say by adding this important rule. And even if we add the important rule, it will always be overwritten by the end user. So that is the ranking here. So we are dealing with three different parties: the user agent, the user, and the author. These three different parties, they can declare values, and then within the party of those, within the style sheets of those three parties, it still then also depends also on specificity. How specific, for example, if we win as author, the user didn't specify anything and we override the user agent, then if we specified things multiple times, then it still depends on specificity. And then which of the declared values will then be chosen, that is the cascading process. One more comment now to the browser default style sheet here. The browser, that is the one for Mozilla Firefox, and each browser uses its own style sheet. And how an element should look like based on their meaning, that is a little bit vague. And some browsers, they determine a different look for a certain element than do others. And that, of course, that would destroy the advantage of the default values being in place in the first place, of giving us the advantage of having to write less code. But if one user agent, one browser does it differently than another one, that will then make us having to worry about one browser and also having to worry how does it look in that browser and in that browser. And that is a very bad thing. And therefore, it would be better if everything would be normalized, if all the browsers did it all in the same way for each and every element. And web developers, some web developers out there have already tested each and every element inside the browsers, and any differences that occurred in or that existed in between the browsers, they just set a common value to them for inside that code. So for example, the HTML element, when we want to determine a line height for the entire text of our website, then if one browser sets it to 1.1 and another one to 1.2, then we can determine it to be 1.15. So without removing the default appearance, we are normalizing it. And people have done it for each and every element, tested the differences, and we can just use that code and use it on our page, because we will always override then the user agent, and therefore it will be normalized then. Everything will look the same among the browsers. And we can place it, which we usually do, inside an external CSS file, which we usually do externally at least during the development of the website. And then inside here, what we would do, we would then just include it again as well here. And we would include it first. So because inside the normalized style sheet, whatever is being selected here is always done by type, element type. And element type selections are the least specific ones. Meaning if we are now selecting by element type as well, for example, if we are selecting H1 and want to define a different font size, then we are sure that we will always override whatever is specified in that style sheet. because our selection comes later, and even though it has the same specificity than inside here, our value inside here defined for the font size will be taken due to the parser parsing from top left to bottom right, and ours coming later, and will therefore override whatever is being specified inside here. So the normalize, this was just an example when we are searching for it in our search engine for a normalized CSS style sheet. We find multiple people who have done this already, so this is just an example here. So that is the cascading process, and one more comment in regards to the browser defaults. However, now comes another position or another location where the values can actually come from for a certain property for an element, and that is inheritance. Some of the values can be inherited down to all other descendants. For example, if we specify a property value on the body, then if that property is automatically inherited, then it will also be applied for each and every element that is inside here. And there are two reasons why inheritance takes place. Reason number one is because text cannot really be selected inside CSS. Apart from, we have seen first letter can be selected and first line can be selected as well, the first line of text. But in general, text cannot be selected. So if we give the P element a background color, a width and a height, for example, it will apply to the P. But if we give it a font size and a color, it will not apply to the P, it must apply to the text. And therefore, because text cannot really be selected, therefore it is being inherited down then from the P to the text. And this is the method how the text can receive the settings in the first place. And therefore, any property that deals with text, that defines the appearance for text, is therefore automatically being inherited down. And now comes the second reason, and that is the convenience reason and also speed, by which the user agent is faster in assigning the property values to the element, depending when things are being inherited in comparison when things are being selected multiple times. For example, when we define a font family to our entire web page, meaning what font to use, that is usually the same for each and every text that we have on our website. Then we can do it on the body element, which represents the most outer element for the entire content. And then we can define the font family to be, for example, monospace, which is kind of a typewriter style. And it will now already apply to each and every text that is inside the body element. Because besides text properties being inherited in general in the first place, it is also a convenience reason and a speed reason. Now, instead of we could actually use the all selector here in that scenario. But let's go into another example. So if we have a table element on the page, a table consists of many cells. And if we want to determine how the distance between the borders of these cells shall be, for example, then we can do so by applying it on the table element, because the border spacing property is being inherited down. Border spacing, right? Border style, border spacing. But we get the point, because it's better, it's more convenient than selecting the cells itself, because cells can be two different elements, so it's more convenient to just, it's TH and TD actually, but it's more convenient to select the table in which the cells are inside, and then it will be inherited immediately to all cells, so without us having to specify two selectors. And it is therefore faster and more convenient to apply this property too. So this is usually the case when there are multiple things within an element that shall receive the same appearance and can only receive the same appearance. Such as all cells. One cell cannot have a different spacing between another cell than another one. So therefore, that is the case, the convenience and speed reason, which is, for example, the case for tables. Or for list items, for example, the list items are inside UL or OL elements. And here we can specify it on the OL and UL element. And the LI elements, which are the actual list items, they will then inherit how their marker shall look like, how they shall be marked with a list marker, for example. and that can only be the same for each and every list item. So the convenience and the speed reason is another reason why inheritance takes place, besides the actual reason that text cannot really be selected. And now we can see, so the h1 element, or the span, or any of these elements here, we did not specify anything for the font family. But the value that will be used for this element will be monospace because it was being inherited down from the body element. So this is now another location where the values can actually come from, besides them being declared inside the different browser, inside the different style sheets that we have seen. And the point here is that each and every element inside our content must ultimately have a certain value for each and every property that exists out there. Because otherwise the user agents would not be able to accomplish their job. For example, let's assume if the color had no property value ultimately for the span element. And if there's text inside this element, what color would be used by the user agent? It is not known. How would the text be displayed? It is just not known. Would there be no text? Because there must be a value. Or for example, if we are using voice family, the property. Now if screen readers have no value for this property, does that mean that there is no voice then? So there must be a voice. It doesn't work. Each and every property that exists out there must have a value in order for the user agent to ultimately accomplish its job. Now, however, even though if we declare something, but if we do not declare anything, the user agent doesn't declare anything, nor does the user declare anything, and if the value is also not being inherited, then which value will be used ultimately to guarantee that there will be a value for each and every property? And that is now finally, if to fill in the blanks, that is where the initial value will be used. And that is defined by the W3C, and each property that we can list here, that are listed here on the left side, will then receive their initial value if nobody else specified anything and if the value was not being inherited, to guarantee that there will be a value in the end for each and every property. Therefore, this value will then be used, the initial value. So let's take a look at this process once again in order to find out what values to use. First of all, there are the declared values from the user agent, the author, that's us, web developer, and the end user. Then comes the cascaded value. That's the one that wins the cascade. So meaning which declared value will be used from which party, and also within the party specificity. So that is the cascaded value. And now comes the specified value, and that is the one that wins the cascade. So the same as this one, or if there is no value, then it's maybe the inherited value if it is being inherited, and still if there is no value, then it will be the initial value. And this guarantees that each element does now certainly have a value for each possible property that exists out there. And now let's take a look at this one for a moment inside our browser right here, maybe in regards to our text. So what we can always inspect here, of course, is the rules itself, which of the declared values will now be used right here. And here we can see it's ranked in specificity. So here it's inline, is more specific than identity. Then comes point and so on, and the one that is used is the one with the important rule attached. And now comes all the values that we can now inspect. It's under computed. And here we can include the browser styles, and here we see now this single span element has now a value for each and every possible property that exists in CSS. And the point again is it must have a value, otherwise the user agent would not be able to accomplish its job. And these are the final values that we can always inspect here, the so-called computed values, which are different from the specified values because some things still need to be converted. For example, we can specify a width and a height in percentages, but ultimately it must be pixels because that is the unit that's being used on the web. So that is now after it is being computed. So that's basically the final value. In actual fact, there are two more categories, which, however, are not that much relevance of relevance to us. So that's the computed value. And that is CSS, the CSS syntax and the logic behind the language. What I now want to mention are two more things in regards to get started for us. So which property should we now start with? Now we know that we need to select our content, and then we can apply the certain properties for dimensions, styling, functionality. There is one property, however, that's the most fundamental one for visually laying out the elements, the content. And that is the display property. This property turns each and every element inside our content into a box. And how this box will behave and what other properties will behave on it depends on the value that is being used here, whatever it is. And now, why is this so relevant? Boxes, everything is a box ultimately. Each and every element is a box, and by having boxes we create the layout in the first place. So that will be our layout, our columns, etc. And once we have our layout in place, that's the foundation of our website, then we can fill the layout with the other boxes, or we position the other boxes inside here. But the layout is the main structure, the main positioning. And what is important here is when we are creating boxes, or each element will be a box ultimately, but having an element, whatever belongs together must be represented by its own element. That will help us a lot in how we position things. So when we have two columns, for example here, one for this and then the other one, then both of them should be within one box, within one element. Because then we only need to position this red box in the center in which it is right now, and do not need to position the two columns individually right here. Further, we can now make better selections in CSS. We can now select the red box in which the two columns are inside by using the child selector, for example. So it's always very, very handy when we have a box, whatever belongs together, when this one has its own box, it will always help us. So that's the property in the first place. And now in terms of positioning, the last comment to be made here, it's also important to understand how the browser actually applies the positioning, how it actually knows it. The browser is a flat object, and therefore it is a 2D object. And 2D always has only two axes. So one is the x-axis, and the other one is the y-axis. Now, this is where the browser starts laying our content, our elements out from this position on. And therefore this is the origin where the x value is 0 and the y value is 0. Meaning any positive value to the right, this is positive. So, and this one down here is as well. If we use positive values to position content, it will move in this direction, or further down in this direction. And if we use negative values, it will move up or to the left. And this is often the case that we would position things positive, further to the right, down, negative, further up or to the left. Now, same applies also to the individual elements themselves as well. They are flat objects. They consist of an x-axis, a y-axis. The origin from the point from which they are laid out is right here, 0, 0. And therefore, if we are positioning a background image inside the element, with positive values, we always get it further to the right or further down. And with negative values, and so this is where the coordinate system actually continues, with negative values, it goes further up or further to the left.